Back in 2018, developer Supergiant Games released Hades, a roguelike action role-playing game in which you took control of Zagreus, the prince of the underworld, through his numerous attempts to escape the confines of the House of Hades and his father's kingdom in search of his mother Persephone. It was very well received and people fell head over heels for the strangely British-sounding Greek god, the Titan-tense action gameplay, and of course, the numerous sexy depictions of the Greek pantheon. In December of 2022, Supergiant Games announced the sequel, and people were on board in a heartbeat. And now, a year and a half later, the game has been released for early access on Steam, and, having experienced the cycle of death and rebirth once more, I had but one important thought. God damn, Scylla's music fucking slaps. Yeah, so while I would normally never touch a game in early access, Supergiant Games more than earned my trust with their previous game, and I figured I'd give my thoughts on the new one, see if it holds up to its predecessor, mostly because I've been obsessively playing it in the last few days and I need to get my thoughts out so I can actually focus on my other videos. And for the sake of transparency, I still haven't finished everything the game has so far. At time of writing, I've still not beaten the Infernal Beast boss, only unlocked 4 of the weapons, and I only just beat the second boss on the surface. Spoiler warning. So this will be just a general summary of what you'll find in the first few hours of playing. I'll also avoid most big story spoilers, so don't worry about that being ruined for you. Well, we've got some time to kill, so let's get to it. Let's talk about Hades 2 for a bit, shall we? At its core, Hades 2 is much the same as the first game. You start each night at your base of operations, the Coven of Hecate in this case. You'll talk to your allies, look into some shopping and upgrades, flirt a little here, point a little there, and then you'll leave to make your, well, not really an escape attempt, I guess, since you're trying to break into a prison this time. You leave to pull an Orpheus, hopefully with better results though. First travelling through the woods of Erebus, then the depths of Oceanus, and then on to the Murning Fields, and whatever comes right after that. I wouldn't know, I keep getting my ass bitten in twain. The gameplay is as tight as you've come to expect from the series, and your attacks, specials and casts are all quick and responsive. The dodge might take some getting used to, as it feels a little slower, and Milleni seems to take a little more time to recover between dashes than Zagreus does, but it shouldn't take you too long to adjust, and it still feels smooth enough that it shouldn't pose too much of a problem. The biggest change to the formula is in the addition of mana. I mean, they call it focus, but it's a blue magic bar, it's fucking mana, let's be real. And omega attacks. By holding the attack, special or cast button, you take a moment to charge mana into a more powerful attack that varies depending on the weapon. The staff gains powerful area of effect spells, the blades give you a rush and a flurry attack, the axe has a spin attack and a block and counter, and the twin flames are bad. Your cast doesn't change between weapons, and instead will change depending on which boons you select. As opposed to the Bloodstones of the first game, Milleni instead has a magic circle that will trap foes in place for a moment, and when Omega cast, will explode and deal damage. You can only use one at a time, but you also don't have to collect it again, and only have to wait for it to expire. Milleni's dash can also be held, and a word to the wise, if you get a boon that affects your dash, it'll probably only work when you're holding it down. Don't make my mistakes. Actually, a lot of boons will specifically affect your Omega abilities, so make sure you read each one carefully. All Omega effects will require a certain amount of mana to use, and while you won't start with any way to regenerate mana in the middle of a fight, entering a new combat room will always refill your mana, so don't hesitate to explodify everything in sight. You're a witch now, make with the magic. Each deity also has a boon that affects mana regen, but as is ever the case with the series, getting that is entirely based on luck, and they're not all the same. Apollo's boon will allow you to regen mana while standing in your cast, while Zeus's will give you a permanent regen effect at the cost of lowering your total mana by a huge amount, and Demeter's will allow you to regen when standing still and doing nothing. You'll also be able to gain a passive regen ability through the Arcana, but it's something you have to unlock and equip, and it's kind of slow. Speaking of the Arcana, they're this game's equivalent to the Mirror of Night, and they allow you to upgrade your capabilities, depending on which you draw and attune to. Unlike with the Mirror, you can only have so many active at one time, determined by your grasp meter. Fitting the witchy theme of the game, you're constantly collecting reagents, and you utilize Psyche to upgrade your grasp. Ashes are used to unlock more Arcana, though more powerful cards will require more and rarer reagents to unlock. Things like sprint speed, mana regen, and death defiance are all tied to individual Arcana, and the system actually works really well. You can also upgrade each Arcana, but that requires another reagent and an incantation. Incantations are the last big new thing to the game. You're a witch, you have a cauldron, you cast spells with it. Incantations are used to permanently unlock features within the game, and while you start with a small number already known, the rest will be taught to you by other characters as you make progress. Each incantation requires different reagents, so be sure to keep track of which you'll need for what, and make sure you activate the Forget Me Not feature as soon as possible. Trust me, it'll save you some trouble. Finally, let's talk balancing, boons, and bugs. Since the game literally just entered early access, it's going to need a good deal of balancing and fixes, so just keep in mind that the complaints I have could very well be fixed relatively soon. Okay? Okay. Right, so the enemy armor in this game is absolutely fucked. I'm not even kidding, it's a huge problem. The first game had armor too, and it was a nuisance to deal with at times, but it never felt insurmountable. But some of the enemies in this game, especially the mini-bosses, have armor that can take 5 times as long to deplete as their actual health bars. And a mini-boss with way too much armor will probably be most people's first stumbling block, even later into the game when you have Arcana to boost you. Enemies as a whole have far more health than in the first game, most likely to make up for the addition of Omega attacks, but it goes too far at times, and some fights feel like you're just hammering away at a brick wall with a toothpick. This seriously needs to be fixed. This isn't helped by the fact that enemies also deal significantly more damage than in previous games, and I actually attribute this to the multi-hit attackers. Most enemies in the original Hades had relatively few attacks per cycle, with those that could deal constant streams of damage few and far between. And even those enemies still did relatively low damage when compared to others around them, to give you the chance to get out of their attack and recover. But it feels like most enemies not only dish out streams of damage, but deal far more per hit. Many of them, like the Screamers in the first area, also chase you down and move nearly as fast as you, which leads to you getting cornered and shipped back to camp in pieces over and over. Newcomers to the series will probably struggle the most with this issue. The game also has its fair share of bugs. There are a few smaller ones, like the one that locked Milleni into facing one direction and wouldn't let me interact with objects until I hard reset the game, but I found a reoccurring issue where the game will suddenly just refuse to let me use the Omega cast, and suddenly having one of your basic tools taken away is jarring to say the least. This, along with the general damage, armor and health problems, are my biggest issues with the game. They by no means make it unplayable, but it's definitely something Supergiant has to get a handle on. Finally, let's talk boons. It's a mix of old and new faces, and even the old ones have been changed to allow for more variation. I'm not going to go into all of them, but know this. A big complaint people had about the first game is that the boons felt largely interchangeable since, aside from chaos, they were mostly just different flavours of do more damage. And it looks like Supergiant Games took these complaints on board because the boons are wildly different from before, with different levels of utility, damage output and assistance. Though I will say, just because of how much fucking HP the enemies in this game have, the burst and vent boons of Hephaestus are your best chance at burning through your enemies. But to give you an idea of some of the changes, Zeus's main thing is the Blitz effect, which places a thundercloud over the afflicted enemy's head, and after dealing 120 damage to them, it will activate and deal a decent amount of additional damage. He doesn't really have the chain lightning effects anymore, and his abilities all deal more damage overall than in the first game. Poseidon's abilities are mainly the same, but the damage output has been largely scaled back to focus more on the knockback effect. Aphrodite's charm effect has largely been replaced by the flutter effect, which drastically increases damage dealt to nearby targets. The charm is still there, but it only lasts 3 seconds as a baseline now, and is tied to either your sprint or your cast. Demeter is actually available from the start this time, and her chill effect has been replaced by a freeze effect that full on stops foes in their tracks, but only lasts for a couple seconds, and then you have to wait 10 seconds before a foe can be frozen a second time. I can't say for sure how well balanced the boons are, but there are definitely game breaking combinations that you can put together with just a little bit of luck. Oh, and there's also your Hex. So eventually you'll come across Milleni, the Moon Titan, and she'll give you a choice from a small list of what are essentially super moves that you can activate after using enough Omega Juice. They range from Time Slow to Self-Healing to Sora's Anti-Farm to a fucking nuke. And once you've selected one, you'll get the chance to upgrade it throughout your run by choosing Selene's boon again, which will give you points to spread around and increase its power. Experiment with it and figure out what works for you. I honestly like the look of Hades 2 more than 1, but that's only partially because I prefer blues and greens to reds and blacks. No, I just find the overall vibe to be more interesting. As I said before, the witch theme is being well utilised in multiple different areas. There's a generally higher feeling of freedom, which makes sense since you're breaking into the underworld instead of out, and prisons are nowhere near as good as keeping people out as they are in. The music is also much better in this game, not just for the aforementioned boss music, but the general background music is also a lot more pleasing to the ear, and it doesn't sound like half the OST was composed by tasing a theremin at increasingly higher voltages anymore. Actually, the sound design all over the place is just sharper and of better quality. A big problem I had with the first game was the constant fucking reverb in everyone's voices, and while that's still a factor, it feels less intrusive here. I'm a big fan of the design overall as well, and the new character portraits for the returning gods are stunning. Though I have no idea how Aphrodite somehow managed to feel even more naked than before. The art direction as a whole is just impeccable, though since the game is in early access, not everything is finished yet. All the keepsakes and a few character portraits and sprites are just placeholder artwork, although there is definitely a deliciously ironic hilarity in Narcissus having no finished artwork at all. A couple characters like Echo and Cersei have what's pretty obviously their concept art on display, which is actually kind of charming, and it makes me excited for the final versions. Overall, the game presents really well, and none of the issues mentioned detract from the overall quality. I want to wrap up this little exercise in me trying to do more with my channel by talking about Milleni, because I honestly find her to be one of the most interesting parts of the game, and this is the only part of the video that gets spoilery at all, so if that bothers you, skip to the on-screen timestamp to jump right to my conclusion in the credits. You've been warned. So what makes Milleni so interesting is her lack of truly personal stakes in the Kronos plot. She's been training to take down Kronos nearly her entire life, and she knows what she's had taken from her, but she still can't summon any real anger about it, since her ties to her birth family don't yet feel fully real. Hecate has been more than just her teacher, she's been Milleni's mother for as long as she can remember. And the thing is, Hecate is a really good parent. We see a flashback of them playing hide and seek. She makes sure to instill the importance of self-care, and she's constantly doing her best to help the young goddess flourish. However, she's also very clearly uncomfortable thinking of herself as Milleni's mother, and she makes sure to remind Milleni that she isn't time and time again, something that clearly saddens the poor girl, as it probably feels like a rejection, even though Hecate likely doesn't mean it that way. Contrast this to Zagreus, whose entire motivation was to find his birth mother. Zagreus had thought Nyx was his quote-unquote true mother, but upon finding out the truth, he immediately and relentlessly throws himself into finding Persephone. And the thing is, Milleni was never under any illusions that Hecate was her birth mother, but she still feels closer to Hecate than she possibly could to the idea of Persephone, and it makes for an interesting internal conflict, since it means that, for most of the story, she's fighting Kronos out of a sense of duty rather than the more universally understood desire for revenge and a reunion with her family. The other characters comment on this too, with Nemesis calling her out for her lack of true passion, and Hecate having to reassure her that her ambivalence is natural given the circumstances. A detail I really like is that Milleni keeps a portrait of her birth family in her tent, and every night you wake up it offers to let you brood at it. But Milleni doesn't really have it in her to brood over what she lost, so she instead uses it to remind herself of what was taken from her, essentially struggling to find that righteous anger she knows she should be feeling. I think she's an incredibly deep and fascinating character, and I really hope the game explores her relationship to Hecate and Persephone more, because there's a lot of potential for an amazingly powerful story about love and family, far more than there was in the first game. They have the tools for a truly fantastic story about love and loss here, and I genuinely hope with all my heart they do their best to realise that. Hades 2 is far from finished. It's still got a lot of work to be done, and it's going to be in early access for a very long time. However, I can honestly say it's already well worth investing your time and money into. It has fun combat, genuinely phenomenal writing, and easily one of the deepest and most likeable protagonists you'll find in any roguelike. Is it better than the first game? No, and that's not quite a fair comparison, but it very easily could be when finished, and I trust Supergiant Games to make that happen. For now, I'd definitely recommend giving it a look, because let's be honest, we've all got time to kill. So why not kill it while listening to the single best diss track the games industry has put out in a fucking decade. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm trying to do more gaming content overall, and this just seemed like it would be fun. Plus, I really did need to get my thoughts out. The game was consuming my brain power and I couldn't get any other work done. I hope this was at the very least entertaining. I'm still new to reviewing games and I wasn't sure how this would turn out. But hey, if you'd like to help me get more practice in helping fund my addiction to video games and gummy bears, or you could just subscribe, that'd be pretty amazing too. Alright, I'm gonna go get some sleep and then get started on that D&D video I've been putting off for the last week. Have a great whenever and death to Cronus.